Welcome all. Welcome to the first UTS event, Australia-China Relations Institute event for 2020. Tonight's event is not just hosted by the Australia-China Relations Institute, it is also part of the UTS Big Thinking Forums. These are forums that UTS regularly run for curious minds. We've certainly got curious minds on the stage here today, and I'm sure there's plenty in the audience as well, to bring to solve, or at least bring some clarity to global complex problems. And I think from an Australian perspective, it doesn't get much bigger or more complex than the Australia-China relationship. So I think it's appropriate that ACRI is running this event tonight in conjunction with the UTS Big Thinking Forum. Before I introduce myself and the panel, on behalf of all those present, I'd just like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands the UTS City campus now stands. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge in this place. My name is James Lawrenson. I'm the Director of the Australia-China Relations Institute, Australia's only research institute that's exclusively focused on informing Australia's engagement with China. Tonight we're using the Lunar New Year as a good excuse to reflect back on the last 12 months of the Australia-China relationship and to gaze into the crystal ball about what might lie ahead in the Australia-China relationship for 2020. Now, to do this, we've assembled a superb panel. I'll very briefly introduce them. Glenda Korporaal, OAM, is the Associate Editor, the business pages at the Australian newspaper. Glenda's been writing about Australia-China economic ties for a long time, but more recently she's just returned from an 18-month stint in Beijing as the Australian's China correspondent. Welcome tonight, Glenda.
Thank you.
Next to Glenda, we have Geoff Raby, AO, the former Australian ambassador to China, of course, in 2007 to 2011. He's currently the chairman and founder of Geoff Raby and Associates, a corporate advisory firm. And I have to say, Geoff, I think it's safe to say that you're the Australian Financial Review's columnist of choice.
I hope so.
When it comes to the Australia-China relationship. I'm also delighted that Geoff has contributed a perspective section in this month's ACRI wrap-up, Australia-China relationship, which we produce each month. Next we have Osmond Chiu. Osmond is a research fellow at the Per Capita think tank, and Osmond, I'm happy to give Per Capita a plug, but what I'd like to tell the audience tonight is that what really gets my attention, or has gotten my attention from Osmond, is a series of commentary pieces he's written over the last year that look at the political debates, the diplomatic debates that often take place between Australia and China. And I think he's one of Australia's keenest observers about how those debates impact on the daily lives of Australia's own Chinese-Australian communities. Osmond's work's been published in a number of leading outlets, The Guardian, Sydney Morning Herald, amongst many others. So welcome to you too, Osmond.
Thanks for having me.
Before throwing to the panel, I thought I might use my position here to offer a few reflections of my own on the Australia-China relationship. When I moved to UTS in 2014 from the University of Queensland, it was already clear to me, as it was to many Australians, that China was a big deal. I think back then the economic relationship really dominated the discussion. I remember in 2011 we had the Reserve Bank Governor, then Glenn Stevens, say that even the proverbial pet shop galah was able to recite the facts of Australia's economic relationship with China. Well, what's happened since then? Australia's exports have gone from 92 billion in 2014 to more than 160 billion today. If we thought it was big then, it is much bigger now. China buys 38% of our goods exports these days. And of course, the relationship is not just bigger, it's far broader. We were just talking in the back about how the Australia-China economic relationship has diversified in ways to an extent that few would have expected even just 5 years ago. So that's one story, but I think a few other things have changed. One of them, and I think we have to state this up front, with certainly my observation anyway, is that I think China itself has changed in ways that I think alarms many Australians, causes concern. Now, there's many examples I could offer up, so excuse me if I just home in on one. This happened last January. An Australian by the name of Yang Hengjun, Dr. Yang Hengjun, and I should say that doctor stems from a PhD that he earned from this university, a UTS graduate. He was detained by the Chinese authorities on suspicion of espionage in January last year. Now, it wasn't until August that he was formally arrested, a charge that the Australian government immediately rejected. Last month, that is 1 year after Dr. Yang was detained and arrested, it was reported that he is still yet to be charged. Now, because Dr. Yang is being detained on matters of state security in China, he has not had access to lawyers or his family. The Australian Foreign Minister has described his detention conditions as unacceptable. So I think it's not surprising that when Australians see how the Chinese state is treating an Australian citizen, that it's not surprising that that causes them concerns about how that state might treat Australia as a country as it grows in power and influence. Now, in addition to the Chinese state changing, there's clearly a geopolitical competition breaking out between China and the United States being Australia's security ally, China being by far our largest trading partner. And just as I think it's got to be said that China's changed over the last 5 years, it's also got to be said that the United States has changed. It is a reality that the United States today is acting in ways that many Australians, the Australian government certainly, considers to be unhelpful at best to its national interests and actively working against our national interests, undermining our national interests at worst. Now, this geopolitical competition plays out not just between China and the US on the international scene, it plays out in Australia where, not surprisingly, you have constituencies that tend to align more with one rather than the other. It's crude, but it's not an unreasonable distinction to say that many Australians from in the defence and security community naturally find themselves orientating towards a more US view of the world, where perhaps those from a business perspective align more, or not align with, but find themselves seeing Australia's national interests as also being reflected in the economic relationship, not just in the security realm. No wonder that an ABC report late last year said that over the last 12 months, media coverage in Australia of China has more than doubled over the last 12 months. That's what we're dealing with in terms of the interest in this country now devoted to China. And haven't we seen that on display just recently? 2 weeks ago, who was talking about the coronavirus? Well, I can tell you that 3 weeks ago, there were no news articles in Australian media about Australia, China and the coronavirus whatsoever. Last week, there were more than 700. We're halfway through this week, but from my reading of the news this week, I think we're going to top 700 this week. And the implications of this virus, the breadth of its impact is really quite extraordinary. Here's an article that you wrote, Glenda.
Thank you.
Yesterday, where you're talking about the impact on minerals companies, you're talking about the impact on tourist operators, education providers, agricultural producers. There doesn't seem to be a sector of the Australian economy that you're not talking about as potentially being impacted upon. It's not just economics, mind you. We've got Australians in China who have struggled to get back. We've been reading the stories about the evacuation flights from Wuhan in recent days. And then you've got Chinese students and Chinese tourists who would love to come to Australia, but they can't. Their access has been blocked by decisions that the Australian government says was motivated by public health, protecting public health. Then you've got the impacts in Australia on Australians, potentially with no connection to China whatsoever. And that's quite extraordinary. And Osmond, I think you might have a bit to say about this. The fact that Australia's own Chinese communities have been reported this week as being the victims of discrimination, racism, outright racism in some cases, from this virus that emanated from a city in China that 3 weeks ago no one in this country was even talking about. Extraordinary. It has political implications. Just overnight, we had the number 2 at the Chinese embassy say that they were disappointed in the way the Australian government's handled this, saying they weren't informed beforehand. And then almost immediately, you have the Department of Foreign Affairs telling Australian journalists that's simply not true. So we've got a diplomatic dispute now as well. And finally, before I flick to the panel, I saw this story in The Australian, and I've got to admit, it's a very serious story, but I had a quiet chuckle over my morning coffee. Here we have an Australian dad in Wuhan caught up in this as a matter of chance. And this was one of the quotes he said. He wrote an op-ed in this morning's Oz, and he said, "It's been interesting trying to write and speak dispassionately and accurately about an extraordinary situation that he just happened to find himself in. Somebody called me a commie stooge, and another reader demanded I openly criticise how the Chinese are handling the situation." Well, when I read that, I thought, mate, I've been in your shoes before. And Glenda, it wouldn't surprise me if you two have, Geoff, you and Osmond as well. So these are the sorts of things that we weren't even talking about 3 weeks ago. Now they're front and centre, having enormous impacts across the economy, but Australian society as well. And on that note, let me move from my own reflections to those of the panel. Glenda, I might start with you. 5 years ago, the economic relationship was described as the backbone of the Australia-China relationship. And I saw Scott Morrison not so long ago said something similar. He quickly qualified it by saying, well, it's more than the economics, but it's still true to say, I think, that it forms a very important part of Australia's relationship with China. When you look back on the last 12 months, you were in Beijing, you saw the data. How would you describe the state and the development of the economic relationship between Australia and China over the last year?
Well, the economic relationship's actually very good. You can go from FMG, iron ore at one. Iron ore's the biggest single Australian export to China. You've got very good relations between Fortescue, BHP and Rio. And when you speak to them, even say this week, we're trying to get their view on life, and they're still doing business with China very strongly. At the other side, we're seeing Australian meat being sold to China in record levels, partly because of the swine flu. But we've seen, Geoff and I have seen in Beijing, people just jumping on planes trying to sell Australian wine in China. People trying to, you've got Blackmore, Swiss, a whole range of companies, and A2 Milk are really pushing into the China market. So, and I think to say it's just economic is not quite right, because you don't trade with someone if you don't like them, if you can't do business with them. I mean, you don't have tourists don't come here if they don't feel welcome, or students don't come. So it's not just a monetary transaction. But if you were to put politics to one side, and there has been issues regarding coal, but you can sort of pick anything from travel, from tourism, from education, from all sorts of small products to mega products. Gold is a big increase in our gold, because I think the China Central Bank's buying more gold. So the economic relationship has actually never been stronger. And I think that's because we supply goods that China wants. China's a growing economy, we can do agricultural minerals. But there also, yes, there's a different legal system. But when people are sitting down doing business, it sort of seems to roughly work. You know, there's these long-term transactions between, say, Woodside, FMG, whatever, that seem to work. And people on both sides want to do business.
It's a pretty upbeat assessment of the state of the economic relationship, although, as you said, it's deeper than that because you don't trade with someone who you aren't friendly with or don't trust. So it's a bit more than just the monetary transaction. Glenda, when I read about the economic relationship between Australia and China, you hear the good stories, but there's another story you often hear as well, and that is that our economic relationship with China, it's not just all the opportunities, it's not just all the good stories, it's also a major source of economic risk. That is, that we're too dependent on China. And out of that comes fairly steady series of reports of the Chinese government using economic tools as a lever against Australia. That is, for example, threatening to stop the flow of tourists or students, or letting Australian wine and beef sit at Chinese ports, to punish Australia if the Australian government makes political decisions that the Chinese government doesn't like. Now, you've just said overall the numbers held up pretty well last year. Have you seen examples, and I know this is not always clear cut, but have you seen examples where you feel pretty confident in saying, look, here's a situation, here's a scenario where the Chinese government did use an economic tool to threaten Australia?
There's two things we've been watching. One's coal, and the coal, there was a very sort of clear holding up of Australian coal at Chinese ports for most of last year. Now, China actually produces its own coal quite significantly, so the imports are sort of small, but it's still an important market for Australia. But they certainly have held up the clearing at the ports of Australian coal at a time when they haven't held up other coal. Other coal from other countries like Indonesia, which is in fact a lot more polluting than us. Another area we have been looking at is barley. We export or have exported quite a bit of barley to China, particularly from West Australia. And China hit Australia with an anti-dumping action on barley about 18 months ago, and that's still dragging through. So we've sort of been watching that. And there's a third element, beef. When Li Keqiang came here in 2017, there was a deal done to help expand Australian beef trade to China, and one of it was essentially they have to recognise individual like abattoirs, and I think at the moment there's only a small number, and there was an agreement that a whole lot of other abattoirs will be recognised, and that has just gone back and forward, and hasn't got anywhere. So yes, there are issues we've been watching, and people have said, had we had a better relationship, the beef trade might have been big. That said, the beef trade from the existing abattoirs has actually set a record of, I think, more than $1 billion last year because of the swine flu. So we're watching, but again, we're not the only country. I mean, you look at Canada, you look at, there's Sweden, there's a whole range of other countries who have trade issues with China as well. But so we are looking and watching at things, but there's been no sign of iron ore being held up, which really is one of the real critical things for Australia and for the budget, actually.
Yeah, as I've been reflecting on this coronavirus over the last week, I mean, it has been interesting to me that over the last few years, we've been so focused on the possibility of the Chinese government using Chinese students and Chinese tourists as a lever of directing influence at Australia, and in the end, well, the ties have been severed, but they've actually been at the instigation of the Australian government.
Is it a vulnerability or a dependency but there's nothing to stop us trading with every other country, with India or other countries, and yet this is where the demand has been, whether the trade has happened. But I mean, yeah, this is highlighted. I was doing an interview with Julie Bishop today. She's taking over she is the new Chancellor of ANU. ANU has 25% of their students from mainland China, 5,500, of which 4,000 are still in mainland China. So it actually shows the extent of the relationship. But ANU is not sitting there saying we won't have students from India or Indonesia. So it is highlighting a dependency or an interdependency. But again, there's nothing stopping more tourists from somewhere else coming, or more students. So again, it's that natural connection that's there.
We talk a lot about India, don't we? We sort of, some people imagine that might be the next China, but I remember last year the Australian government commissioned an economic engagement report about India, and the report put up the hope that we might triple our exports to India from 15 billion to 45 billion by 2035, remembering, of course, that currently we're exporting more than 160 billion to China. So it seems to me those basic economic complementarities that you're talking about are extremely strong in the China relationship in a way that they simply don't exist for other relationships, including big ones with big countries like India.
Yes, we always, India is a bit of a boulevard of broken dreams. I mean, I've written about Prime Minister after Prime Minister, and I also wrote when Morrison was going to go about how India is going to be the next thing, and it never actually happens, possibly because there is not the complementarity in the relationship that we do have with China.
Geoff, if I can move on to you, in your perspective column that you contributed to the ACRI monthly wrap-up of Australia-China relations for this month that all our audience have with them, you made this observation, if I can just quote you directly. You said, as long as China continues to make an oversized contribution to a healthy balance of payments for Australia, Canberra evinces no interest in working towards restoring the high-level relationship. Now, I imagine some people might read that and say, well, there you go, Geoff. Canberra can play hardball with Beijing at a policy level, at a diplomatic level, and the economic benefits of the relationship will keep flowing. What's your response to that? What's the problem?
Well, in a sense, that's what I'm saying. I'm describing the reality today. Our situation's a bit like what it has been between China and Japan for many years. It's described in Chinese as hot economics and cold politics. And I think Glenda has set out very clearly how the trade relationship continues to boom. Although one qualification, Glenda, to your comments, which I'd make, is that iron ore is a bit of a separate case, because there was the massive tailings dam failure in Brazil last January, and that's basically taken Vale out of the picture. So that's underpinned extraordinarily high iron ore prices, and prices today are in the mid-80s. The WA budget's got them at about $49 a tonne. So that underscores, I think, the extent of the bonus to our trade that's come from that terrible tragedy in Brazil a year ago. But yes, look, that's what Canberra's seeing. And for those people in Canberra who think that as I describe it in the article as well, the quixotic pursuit of Australia trying to redefine the nature of our relationship with China, even though it's an asymmetric relationship and we are the smaller partner in that relationship, those people in Canberra who take that view feel encouraged by the fact that trade continues to go on, the current account looks good, and people are starting to say, well, who cares? And that's fair enough at one level, but that's only if you see the relationship with China in purely transactional terms.
Should we, Geoff? Or should we be seeing it in more than that? So what should we be seeing?
Absolutely. Well, China is not only the second biggest economy in the world, and by far the biggest economy in the region, it is now the dominant power in the region. And if we don't wish to engage with the dominant power in the region across a range of issues,
like
regional security, transnational security issues, asymmetrical security issues like people smuggling, drugs, a range of crime, if we don't wish to engage with the biggest power and the biggest polluter in the region on climate change, and maybe China won't want to engage with us, I mean, that's probably a reflection of their own policies, then so be it. But we are going to be a marginal player in the region. And I believe that we've increasingly marginalised ourselves in the region because we're unable to work out how we manage our relationship with the United States and with China. And what we've seen in the past 18 months is us hewing ever closer to the United States. As on one hand, US policy to the region has become much more erratic and unstable, and power has shifted much more to China, we have decided to glue ourselves to the hip of the United States. And that means that for countries like China, as I say, why would you speak to the monkey when you can deal with the organ grinder? And so we have given up the option at present of having an independent voice in the region by having an independent foreign policy. And therein is the problem. But we can't have a credible foreign policy if you can't deal with the biggest economy and biggest power in the region.
Okay. So another response, Geoff, that I've heard is this one. I wonder if I could put this to you. There's clearly diplomacy that everyone would agree is bad. Poor diplomacy that should be avoided. For example, even folks that are generally happy with the policy direction of the Australian government towards China over the last 2 years, I don't think they were particularly thrilled when Malcolm Turnbull said that the Australian people were standing up to China. I mean, I think that sort of comment has more or less across the board been described as hugely unhelpful. So that, I think we can agree, that could be avoided. But is it realistic to imagine that as Australia defends its interests, for example, we might talk about the South China Sea. We have an arbitration decision in 2016 that China rejected. That arbitration panel was constituted under the United Nations Law of the Sea. The Australian government, I thought pretty reasonably afterwards, said, well, we expect all countries, China included, to abide by the international conventions that it signed up to. China wasn't happy with Australia's stance, but should we avoid doing that? Or I guess my point is, can we avoid not antagonising China? I mean, just simply when Australia stands up for its national interests, like we stand up for Yang Hengjun, who's currently detained in China, without access to a lawyer or his family. It's not unreasonable that the Australian government says something. What's your response to that? Avoid bad diplomacy, but how do we deal with an actor that is like that?
Well, it's a very good point, and thanks for raising it. And really, it's about how we deal with these issues in public forum and privately with the Chinese government, and it's basically to be smarter, more nuanced and diplomatic about what we do. Now, with the South China Sea, it's a great example. And I won't quote your esteemed predecessor, who made quite a major contribution to the public debate at the time. But there was no reason for Australia to have an outlier position. There was no reason for Australia to be more vocal, more strident, more public than any of the market countries that we would normally align ourselves with. And in fact, the United States had nothing to say because the United States is not even a signatory to the Law of the Sea Convention. And I'm not excusing in any way China's behaviour in the South China Sea, but just to chirp like the proverbial parrot, we support a rules-based system, as Turnbull and Bishop did, and become so shrill and strident about it is completely unhelpful to our interests. Because what is the rules-based system? Is it a rules-based system if the United States is not a member? I mean, this is realpolitik. And we have to get back to foreign relations based on interest politics. And we have to recognise our weight and what is the best way to prosecute our interests. What we did was almost counterproductive to our interests. If we wanted to be heard, if we wanted to have influence, if we wanted to talk to China about adhering to a system of rules, then that's a conversation you should have in private. We could join, if you like, the market countries, and a number said, China should adhere to the Hague Tribunal findings, but that is how we should have nuanced it and presented it. There was no reason for us to get out in front. And honestly, Bob Carr, I think he made a major contribution at the time pointing that out in UTS and your centre. There was no other voice in Australia that was saying, hey, this is unnecessary. And so we should make our voice heard. Look, there's a great example of when we did adopt a more nuanced and diplomatic approach to these sorts of matters, and that is the Crown Casino arrests. Remember, a whole bunch of them went up to China, they all got chucked in the slammer, and whether they had broken any laws or not, that was the situation the government was facing. And what the government did on that occasion was basically say nothing publicly. And I think within a year, they were out. Contrast that to Stern Who, which I had to deal with when I was ambassador back in 2009, where the Australian government, and it was a different government than the one that dealt with or different party that dealt with the Crown case, was out in public questioning the Chinese legal system. We don't like the Chinese legal system, and we don't like Chinese human rights performance. But it's not for another government to have a public discourse about what's wrong with the Chinese legal system. And I remember one minister, I wandered into his office because I was called back secretly by the Prime Minister at the time, which ended up on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald and Age. My poor mother, who I didn't tell I was back, rang me and said, Geoffrey, you're on the front page of Australia. Why haven't you come down to have tea? I said, it's a secret, Mum. But, one minister, I walked in his office and he said, g'day, Geoff. He's a bit of a friend. He said, g'day, Geoff. How are we going to spring him? How are we going to get Stern Who out? I said, Minister, what, you're thinking about sending in the SAS? I mean, it's mad. I mean, the mentality is mad. And so on the Stern Who occasion, we handled it appallingly. And of course, being, the embassy saying to Canberra, this is going to be totally counterproductive. Get it out of the media, say nothing, and handle it through normal channels, through the protocol department, the Foreign Ministry. And they didn't. But I really admire the advisors to the government at the time during the Crown situation. I wasn't part of it, of course, completely looking as a private citizen at it, but I could only congratulate how well that was handled, government, how well that was handled, and the senior officials who managed to convince ministers to shut up and work through normal processes. So there are examples of this. There are many examples. And it's called diplomacy.
Okay. All right. We've had a discussion of the economics, the diplomatic relationship. Now I'd like to focus on something that's closer to home. Osmond, you said in October last year, in a wonderful article, track it down if you have to, here's a quote that stood out to me. You said, "It is not a pleasant time to be a politically engaged Chinese Australian." It sounds like you were understated there when you said it's not a pleasant time to be a politically engaged Chinese Australian. You followed up with this statement. You said, "Until the ramping up of the People's Republic of China influence debate earlier this year, early in 2019, to a daily topic, I had not felt this sense of dread. I had not felt this sense of dread since the incarnation of One Nation 2 decades ago." Osmond, can you describe for us here tonight the dread that you felt, and how does it impact on you, what you say, as a politically engaged Australian?
Yeah, thanks, James. I think it's an important discussion to begin. I think I didn't use those words lightly. I think
Mine dropped off as well.
Yep, dropped off as well. Yep. I think 2019 was a turning point in the public debate about China. While we've had the foreign interference debate for the past few years, essentially since the release of Silent Invasion, I think last year it cut through into the public consciousness in a way it hadn't previously. And I think as a result, we've sort of seen the normalisation of what are, in my opinion, quite xenophobic narratives into the mainstream by people both on the political left and the right in this country. So just some examples that come to mind include sort of these characterizations of any organisation that has any link to China as potentially an arm of the People's Republic of China. But for me, more disturbingly, this characterization of people of Chinese heritage potentially as a threat from within. So the few examples that come to mind include sort of this treatment of international students almost as a potential threat from within. And the other one that really sticks out in my mind is the sort of commentary about Gladys Liu. So my politics are on the complete polar opposite of hers, but this characterization of her as somehow being a spy for Beijing or secretly loyal to them really is deeply disturbing and quite frankly racist. And the fact that people can't even conceive or really understand that is really disturbing for me. So in terms of the foreign influence debate, I think there's real uneasiness about it and engaging with this debate. A lot of what is discussed is very opaque. This debate is essentially being driven by leaks to the media primarily. So while I think undeniably there is a level of interference, it's often very unclear what is fact and what is fiction and what has been exaggerated, what has not been. And the fact that unless you are closely watching this debate and knowing as much as you can, you really haven't grasped it that well. So there are a lot of politically engaged people that I know that I have conversations with. When I speak to them, there's a lot they don't know. And I wouldn't consider myself an expert on this topic, just someone who pays close attention to it. And I guess for me, and this is something I've spoken about with other people, the real concern is where this leads, what happens next. Because the real fear is not what is happening right now, but where it leads to, because it's really unclear. In the 1990s, you knew who the opponent was, you knew what you were opposing, you knew it was overt racism, whereas what we're seeing now is something that's more subtle, and I think that's what makes it much more insidious, that you're not sure about what it will mean, whether it will mean that there is a sense of distrust of Chinese Australians, whether it means that there's unconscious biases, conversations that Chinese Australians will not have the same opportunity to participate in our society, in business, in politics, in our public institutions. And I think that is really what drives a lot of the concerns, the sense that you kind of have to prove that you are loyal. The assumption that you are not loyal is what's taken by someone who doesn't necessarily know you.
Right. So, I can see there's some appreciation from the audience for making that point. In terms of the impact and the ability of a Chinese Australian to participate in what many of us wouldn't have any dramas with at all, but you're saying Chinese Australians do face additional challenges. I remember a research interest of yours that you expressed some interest in was the issue of whether Chinese Australians are getting security clearances working in the Australian government. There's been some anecdotes that I've heard, and I'm sure many of us have heard, about people struggling in that way. In other words, we don't have Chinese Australians where we really do actually want them to be. Can you give us an update on your research in that area? I know it's often anecdotes. The government's not openly publishing this data, but do you have any reporting that you can offer for us tonight?
Yeah, I guess one of the challenges is that there really isn't reporting on things like security clearances, and often when people do not receive a security clearance, they aren't really told why. So I think people might have seen, I think it was a few weeks ago, there was an article about how many, I think Chinese American, or people of Chinese heritage who were contractors to the US government had being denied and how it's far greater than those who had no Chinese heritage. I guess given the lack of data, it's hard to determine what exactly is going on. But through my conversations with people who have worked in the Australian public service currently and previously, I think there is definitely a sense there's been a shifted mood. I would also say that I think it's in particular parts of government from the various conversations I've had. So particularly those based in Canberra, central agencies, and people within agencies who sort of deal with more internationally focused areas. And the other thing I found through having these conversations was there was a distinct difference between people of Chinese heritage who were either born in mainland China or who have links to mainland China and those who do not. So I think it is particularly felt by certain people within the APS. I guess what makes this much more complicated is that the lack of data, which raises questions about, is this actually intentional or is this unconscious biases? Particularly given we've seen a sort of shift in risk assessments when we look at citizenship processing and visa processing. So there's been a number of stories about, delays in citizenship for people from the PRC and similarly for students from the PRC. So I definitely think it's something that deserves much more attention, particularly because if people of Chinese heritage are seen as a security risk, I think it undermines our own China capability. So I think the real great example is, I think last year there was an article in The Australian about the team that looks after the Foreign Influence Transparency Register, and there was not a single person in that team who had Chinese language skills. Particularly given that I think they say that only 130 people in Australia have the requisite Chinese language skills. If we're serious, we actually need to hire Chinese Australians to these positions, and it's a real concern that things like security clearances could be preventing this.
Right. Osmond, just one final question before I come back to you, Glenda. When we're talking about Chinese Australian communities, I like to say not community because they're a very diverse group, you've raised the challenges of some Chinese Australians being described as a fifth column, a tool of influence for the Chinese party state. Now, there's other Chinese Australians who say they face a very different problem, and that is their freedoms in Australia that people like me enjoy. Those freedoms are being threatened by the Communist Party of China. For example, I think of a media outlet we have in Australia called the Vision Times, independent Chinese language media. The reporting I've seen around that is that the Chinese embassy has been in touch with their advertisers and put pressure on those advertisers to withdraw their support for those sorts of independent publications. Now, I find that pretty disturbing. That's an act of foreign interference that I think Australia should be on the front foot in responding to. So they're another group. As a government, I guess the Australian government has been quite on the front foot compared with many other countries. We introduced these new foreign interference laws to clamp down on that sort of activity. Are you seeing any signs that these measures the Australian government has taken, that these measures are bearing fruit? That is, Australian Chinese feel free to enjoy the same freedoms that I do.
Yeah, well, I think it's definitely an important topic to discuss. Look, I think it's undeniable that there has been a harassment and intimidation of people who are seen as dissidents of the Chinese government in Australia. I think there are enough examples to say, no, it's actually happening. And I think it's undeniable that we should be protecting people's rights and freedom of expression on Australian soil. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. In terms of what the Australian government is doing, I think it's probably less clear. I think what's happened has been there's far more visibility to these debates and these concerns than there has been in the past because there has been the public eye. In terms of their effectiveness, I mean, I guess there's a level of effectiveness by having the sheer fact of transparency, by highlighting something that's occurring, so it dissuades people from those actions. So I guess in a sense it has worked to an extent, but not necessarily in the way that people had originally envisaged. That's the sense I'm getting.
Okay.
James, can I
Sure.
just come in quickly on this? I've written about the so-called China threat industry, and I think it's become an industry on many occasions. And you know, what bothers me most about it is really going to Osmond's point that, look, sure, all this stuff happens, but the Chinese government's not the only perpetrator of interference in Australia. It doesn't make it right, but we need to be adult about it. What's completely lacking in the China threat discussion is a proportionality in context. Completely lacking. And so if someone is vaguely, like Gladys Liu from Chisholm or whatever, faintly been touched by an organisation that may have some tenuous link to the United Front Work Department, then you're immediately branded not only as an agent of influence, but a potential security threat to Australia. There is no proportionality when it comes to discussing the Chinese threat and no context. And at heart, what bothers me most is that it undervalues the strength of our democratic institutions. We have a free press, we have a vigorous parliament. There's been one, if I'm not counting, one politician, ACRI, who's been outed and been forced to resign from parliament. This is like 2.5 or 3 years of intense media scrutiny. Where is that? I mean, of course the Chinese embassy does what you say it does, and the consulate does what you say. I'll finish this point, but take the recent elections in Taiwan. No political body, political group could have been under more pressure during the Taiwan election than Taiwan in terms of fake news, interference. We heard about it endlessly leading up to the elections. Our media was covering it. It was always covered only in terms of mainland Chinese interference, which is all true. I'm prepared to believe it all. But then look at the result. So much for the influence. And I think we have to be much more robust and have much more confidence in our own institutions to deal with this. We live in an ugly, nasty world, and people are going to try and do bad things to us. But we have very, very strong institutions in this country.
You'd have to say, to the extent that the Chinese government has been seeking influence in Australia, they've got a pretty poor return.
Precisely.
Just sort of following on from what you said, Geoff, I think my sense is part of the salience of the sense of threat from the PRC is because of, I guess, low trust in governments. And the sheer fact that a lot of this discussion and debate often doesn't happen in the usual spheres that people are used to, often, in online on, WeChat. Essentially, most people don't even know what it is. Like people who are politically engaged, I have to explain to them how it actually works. So I think that has sort of built it up as well, the sense of, I don't know what this is, and this is big, bad threats. So it's very hard to comprehend what it is because what's happening isn't in a language that I understand.
And on that, sorry, but when you talk about, when you put in that context, one of the biggest threats to our institutions is the fact that so much of this China threat is driven by the security intelligence agencies in Canberra feeding the media. And how is it in Australia's interest that the intelligence agencies are feeding the media and running a policy agenda? Really?
Glenda, as a journalist, you might, well, I'm not going to force you to respond to that, but you should feel free to.
I think what I find, because I speak to a lot of people in the business community, they're sort of careful what they say. I mean, these are people who go back and forth to China a lot, or they have until recently, and they're sort of feeling uncomfortable about well, what do we say? And then they feel themselves, if they say, well, look, we have good relationship on the trade side. I was trying to be not over-optimistic, but the economic side to date has been strong.
Right.
But the business community, there's another thread there. The business community doesn't like to criticise government, and they don't want to come out and criticise the government. But they're the ones that should be perhaps coming out a bit more and at least stressing the importance of the relationship. But when you talk to them, often they'll tell you off the record they're not very happy about some of the things the government's doing, but they won't talk about it in a public way. So there is that. It's interesting. One of your points, and it's there is a huge change in the debate here, but one of the threads has been what has changed in China. And what's changed in China is Xi Jinping, who came in and at a time when the Chinese economy was booming, but there also was a lot of corruption, and that wasn't going down very well at all, for obvious reasons with normal people. So he did a mass crackdown on corruption. However, he's continued to impose a much more sort of Maoist each year, each few months, more and more controls, and so that is affecting the debate. He is putting pressure on the ambassadors, and it's not just here, all around the world. They, we've seen with the ambassador here and the deputy, who's very outspoken, Mr. Wang. China and Wang Yi, the foreign minister, are putting enormous pressure on the ambassadors to call everything out. Don't just sit back there. Put something on your website. The Chinese ambassador in Sweden is very aggressive and outspoken, and the ambassador in Canada. So there's a change in what's coming from China, a more aggressive, more nationalistic China that is following through into some things happening here.
Okay.
But again, that should be, and we need to understand that, but that shouldn't play out into, a negative towards Chinese people living and working.
Sure. Okay, let me finish off this, and then I'll throw it to the audience for some questions. Glenda, Geoff, Osmond, if I can get you all to stare into the crystal ball and give me a quick response to this. Glenda, I'll start with you. The economic outlook for 2020. We came off a very buoyant base. Last year I saw the numbers in the ACRI monthly brief. It says through to November our exports are up 30%. Well, we can't expect that again this year. The coronavirus has obviously you've been writing about it, had an enormous impact on the Australian economy. How do you see things unfolding for the economy?
Obviously, in the short term, there's going to be an economic slowdown in China, and we're already seeing directly in tourism and in the concerns about the academic fallout, the education. Looking forward, there is this issue of, are we taking things for granted? Have we cruised on past policies? Look at the China FTA, which is negotiated over many years, and finally it was about 3 or 4 years ago. Our exports are benefiting from the no tariffs, but China and the US have reached their own trade deal, giving some special access. So the point is, into the future, will we have the growth and opportunities? There still will be strong economic ties, but will China choose to, say, buy barley from Uzbekistan or a Belt and Road country rather than from Australia? So the thing is, will it continue to grow as strongly? And I think probably not, for a number of reasons. Not as strong as it has in the past. And as you say, the last year, of course, the government pats itself on the back for its surplus, which is partly due to the iron ore price, which is partly due to the Vale situation. But there is this sort of taking for granted at a political level of the relationship and taking for granted of the economic success. And, at some point where they have a choice, where China has a choice, do you buy from Australia or do you buy from somewhere else, they might buy from somewhere else.
The US-China trade deal is a great example of where you've got a US government that is making decisions that are plainly contrary to Australia's national interests. The fact that you could have Australian businesses that are competitive, offering a good quality product, but China might buy from the US simply for a political reason. I mean, that's pretty disturbing.
The Chinese say that other countries won't be disadvantaged, but in the end, if they're under pressure from a very angry Donald Trump, are they going to buy, a certain, say, beef from America or from us,
right.
on
or
the
LNG,
margin? Yes.
Right. Geoff, let's talk about Donald Trump. Now, I think it's fair to say that, generally speaking, I don't mean to categorise you as a pessimist. That's not my intent. But when I read you in the pages of the Australian Financial Review and you're talking about the diplomatic outlook for Australia-China relations, you come across as a bit pessimistic sometimes. So can I just throw out a hypothetical to you and get your comment? November this year, Donald Trump gets re-elected as the President of the United States. We've got 8 years of Trump. Is there, in your view, any chance that the US-Australia relationship could become so chaotic that Australian foreign policy might start becoming more responsive to realpolitik, as you describe it, knowing that the US is no longer considered a stable partner that it once was?
Yeah, I mean, who can comment on what Trump's going to do after he's elected? I mean, really. But as a hypothetical, I think there's a very good chance of that. I mean, Trump's merrily going around wrecking the WTO, which is of fundamental importance to Australia's interests. And if that continues, I mean, Australia's going to have to start to take positions which are not so comfortable vis-a-vis our relationship with the United States. We've done those things in the past, but for the last decade or so, we've been very reluctant to do that. But it's hard to know where Trump's going to go after the election. It's really idle speculation. Does he invade Iran or attack Iran? I mean, if that were to happen, I'd be amazed if he doesn't whistle up Australia's support. And we're there in some way, shape or form, notwithstanding where our national interests lie. The big one, of course, is US-China. What's come out of the trade, where that's ended up now is pretty much where I thought it would some years ago when I wrote about it when it started, and that is there would be a deal done for the election, and this was entirely short-term politics. Does Trump buy onto the neocon agenda of people like Pence and those around him that there has to be decoupling? I mean, that's really the issue for us. It's not so much chaos in US foreign policy, but does he genuinely, seriously, comprehensively pursue decoupling? I think probably at one level not, because I don't think he cares very much. And he's been re-elected and he can't be elected again. Well, he's indicated that may not be a certainty. But the ideologues around him clearly want to decouple. And Glenda's made all the right points about Xi and his increasing authoritarianism and the increasingly muscular, I don't use the word aggressive, but muscular and assertive foreign policy. And clearly there's a view in elite areas of the United States that this has all gone far enough, and they have buyer's regret, and China hasn't become the liberal democracy they thought 20 years ago when they pursued engagement. But I think at a practical level, I'm less worried about decoupling. And in a fascinating way, this coronavirus episode is highlighting the extent to which the world economy is so deeply integrated through production links around the world, supply chains. You see today South Korean car producers saying they're having to shut factories because they're dependent on parts from China and so on. And so is the United States. And you saw Trump fudge on Huawei, again, for the same reason, the interdependency. So I guess I'm not pessimistic to conclude. I'm cautiously optimistic that the global economy is now so deeply integrated, even a chaotic president like Trump won't go down the path of serious decoupling. And what I think we've seen enough of Trump is that he's not a mad ideologue like the people around him, hence the sacking of Bolton and so on.
Thank you for correcting my characterisation of you as a pessimist. Osmond, your time to stare into the crystal ball. There's been a couple positive developments when it comes to Chinese Australians. Well, with Gladys Liu, she describes herself as a Chinese Australian, first Chinese Australian Member of Parliament. I saw the fantastic forum in Melbourne recently celebrating Australian Asians and in putting more Asian Australians into leadership roles. How do you see things unfolding for Australia's Chinese communities over the rest of this year?
Well, I think in many ways things can only get better given 2019 was rock bottom for Chinese Australians in many ways. But I think my sense is there's a sort of changing mood. I think amongst many there was a sense that last year you just had to keep your head down and things might blow over. And I think there is a growing realisation that no, things aren't going to blow over, so we actually have to start being out there, start speaking up, speaking out when we actually see these examples of racism, also organising and being out there in the public sphere and showing we're active and engaged citizens. And like particularly amongst younger generations, that's the sense I'm getting. And I think also not just focusing on Chinese Australians, going back to the Asian Australian Leadership Conference, which I was an attendee at, I think this sort of understanding that in many ways Australia is behind comparable nations when it comes to the representation of Asian Australians. And I think the mainstreaming of that is really important. And, the conference I think was a first step. And I think we'll see much more this year. So I think those are the two things that I see which are, positives for this year after a pretty dismal year last year.
And a tough start to the year with the coronavirus, but perhaps we will see things pick up. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let me invite questions from the audience. Now, I do have one rule. If you've been to ACRI events before, you will know that I say this every time. I would like the first question to be from a female member of our audience. This is reflecting academic research, and what this research finds is that when questions are invited, 90% of the hands raised are men, and when the moderator goes to a man with the first question, overwhelmingly subsequent questions come from more men. Now we've got a 50-50 split in the audience, so it makes sense to have 50% of the questions come from our male. And I see we've got a hand up in the very first row. I can see you very clearly even without my glasses on.
Thank you for asking me to speak first. I just perhaps the first is just a comment that I also make a mistake for saying that the first Chinese member of parliament is Gladys Liu. I know Gladys. I met her a couple of times. She's from Melbourne. I am a very first Chinese member of parliament in Australia, to be frank. That was 31 years ago. So I'd just like to correct her facts, that's all. But I also want to say that what he said, I want to support earlier, the narrative he was speaking about. So about there is a Chinese threat. You are threatening. It is true that I know of the Chinese community members, even like myself, sometimes you have this passive coercion from the, I'm not accusing them to do it, but it is very immaterial that they coerce you not to attend certain, doing certain things if they feel that it is not they like you to do. Like for example, I cite you an example. Just over 3 years ago, I think we all know, Martin Lee and Anson Chan. They are two old associates of mine when I was a member of parliament 30 years ago. 1996, they came because of the 1997 handover of Hong Kong to China. As a friend, associate, because I was a lawyer and Martin Lee is a lawyer, so we just have a mix of Hong Kong friends at lunch. That was on the newspaper. And I'm not anti-China either. I have to make it very clear. I'm just very impartial Chinese-Australian woman here for over half a century. We believe that after that, I've been here for over 40 odd years since the diplomatic relation with China. I was always invited because I'm quite an active person in the Chinese community. Since then, I was completely cut off as their guest. Nothing. They completely ignore me. Not only that, he actually, more or less, someone actually told me directly on my face that you are being classified as independent Hong Kong because I came from Hong Kong. That's kind of a very passive coercion that you're doing the right thing by them. So I agree with you. I agree with what Osmond has said. So this is an example that many Chinese Australians would not dare to stop doing the right thing by our Chinese Australian rules.
Okay, all right. Thank you for the comment. Thank you. All right. Yeah, can I just go, just behind you there is another, yeah, could it, is that okay? Thank you.
I'm speaking from a non-academic, non-business, non-commercial, regular person who doesn't know a lot about China, but I'm interested in the Peter Hartcher quarterly essay, and I picked up lots of different perspectives. And Geoff, I certainly picked up the Grace Liu one was something we should have been concerned, and I was interested that you said, no, it's relative. And I was interested too, Glenda, when you spoke about coal being on the wharfs, because I thought that there was a policy of China sort of so-called punishing countries that speak out by going slow on removing exports from their wharfs and so on. So I know it wasn't a very substantial quarterly essay. There was lots and lots of things to reflect about. But my question is, to gain knowledge and to understand what you're talking about, we have to kind of really engage and start reading things and thinking about things. And I definitely picked up more worrying things than you've reflected to me tonight. So was that article, in your view, that essay, was that substantial for people who don't have expertise? Did anybody read it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I kind of felt that the John Garno effort to Turnbull was of interest to us all, and the things that happened last year. And anyway, that's my question. For people who aren't necessarily informed or non-academic, we have to turn to regular journalists and feel confident that what we're reading is significant and substantial. But I felt that you were giving that more of a lesser, I guess, importance tonight. Could you comment for me?
Yeah, I'm happy to comment. I guess, firstly, talking about the quarterly essay, my sense is that a lot of the views were from a particular perspective. So what I find with this debate, particularly when it's in the media, often the people who are most prominent in publishing the articles about the China debate really have a particular viewpoint, so they elevate certain voices. So that can often cause quite a skew. And so I think the debate we see in the media is very much one particular viewpoint, where while there are sort of differing views. And I think it also overlooks that there are also competing interests behind the views that are put forward as well. In terms of Peter Hartcher's quarterly essay, I guess as someone who has sort of been following the debate for the past 18 months closely, a lot of it wasn't necessarily new to me. I've sort of heard it before because I've closely watched it. I did find a number of the things in there concerning, just based on, firstly, voices that were elevated, but also some of his suggestions. So in terms of the suggestion of Peter Hartcher, he made this kind of distinction between, we might be concerned about immigration from mainland China, but we're okay with immigration from Taiwan and Hong Kong because of values. And it seemed to be a sleight of hand to say, I'm not actually suggesting racial profiling. But I think it's important to know that when the debate about Chinese migration in the 19th century existed in Australia, it wasn't necessarily constructed on racial terms. It was very much constructed on values. So if you read John Fitzgerald's book, Big White Lie, it's really good because it goes into this debate, how there was essentially this construction of what was Australian, which is about egalitarianism, mateship, freedom, and the someone who was Chinese was essentially an Oriental despot who, was servile, prioritised profit, and the fact that we had to have a white Australia was because the values of these migrants for China were incompatible with Australia. So I think it's that context which people often overlook, and which I think has meant that while people who are very hyper-aware and attuned to it say, hey, no, actually what you're saying has massive problems, people who have not sort of read the history and follow this go, oh no, I'm not being racist because, I have friends who are Chinese. I don't have any hatred towards people of Chinese heritage, which is true. But there is that sort of xenophobia behind that statement. And sort of going on from that, there were a few comments from, for example, Fen Chongyi, which I found were not very helpful. So, for example, his sort of characterization of Chinese, like Australian citizens of Chinese descent, as somehow not really showing who they really supported. So some of these suggestions about the loyalty of Chinese Australians were very concerning, and particularly I find that when someone of Chinese heritage, say these things, people feel that it gives them the license to say, oh no, I'm not actually racist because someone who's Chinese has said this. So obviously there's a lot of debate and discussion about what Peter Hartcher has said. People will disagree with me, but from my perspective, those were some of the issues with what was in his quarterly essay.
Glenda, Geoff, any comment on the quarterly essay? Or
just to say quickly that I just see it as just another and quite latterly addition to the China threat industry. The Sydney Morning Herald's been way out in front on the China threat industry. And it's my point earlier, the whole thing lacks context and proportionality. We're talking about relatively few individuals, relatively few episodes, and all the people he quotes, John Garno, Josky, the whole lot of them are all part of the China threat. And the other thing is, of course, people quote ASPI all the time, the Australian Strategic Studies Institute in Canberra. It's funded by the Department of Defence and the US industrial military complex. And no one's shy about it. Just go onto their website and there's Raytheon, Boeing, Westinghouse, you name it, Lockheed. And you think, now, what is Australian tax money through the Department of Defence being put into a Strategic Studies Institute that's dealing with domestic issues around the China threat? I think there isn't enough calling out of this, and there isn't really a debate as yet in Australia. One side is very heavily stacked, and there are very few people coming out and saying, well, hang on, where's the balance? Where's the context? What's the proportionality? How big, how much, how often? And I think that's completely what Hartcher's article lacks.
Yes, I think, Peter's article was a collection of negative, whole collection of John Garno's arguments and experience. But I think you're absolutely right. If you sit there, and I've sat in China, if you sit there and just read the newspapers, Sydney Morning Herald and the Australian used to have different points of view, and the Sydney Morning Herald has been sort of almost leading a China threat, and now they're linked with Channel 9, and Channel 9, they were linked with ABC and did some couple of things with Four Corners, and now with Channel 9. And if you just sit there and read the papers, most of it is China threat, and it drives the embassy and the consulate nuts, and they're always ringing up, and you're going, well, But I think newspapers are only one source. Look around. Walk around the streets and see the integration that Australia is having with Asia. See people going about their lives, their business. I think, yes, I think if all you did is pick the papers up and read them, you're absolutely right. But I think the other thing is there is a language issue. You're not getting perhaps certain people banging on the door getting their argument in the Australian, because they probably don't read it, or they probably aren't reading a lot of the local press. But I think this is a time when we have to look with our eyes as to what's happening, as well as reading. But there is, in the last couple of years, so many stories have been negative China threat, where's that coming from? A more aggressive US perhaps. But I think, talk to people, look around at the level of integration that we're having with Asia. And quite frankly, we have absorbed a lot of students from China from very little to a lot of tourists, like we were talking about with SARS, 2003, very few tourists. Now there's 1.4. There's been a huge shift. And yet this has all happened quite happily. So I think the answer is it's very complicated and we have to understand many different nuances. It's not like this is good, this is bad, this is... you have to study it, look around, and there's many different strands now happening. I can see, having lived in China, and I've gone to China as many times as I can, there is a very different Chinese government, but the people there are also having to deal with a more controlling government. And, do they like that or not? You just look at the Twitter feeds about the coronavirus. A lot of people have been trying to get that story out within China. So we shouldn't characterise the Chinese government with 1.4 billion Chinese people. So it's complicated and it's not an easy answer.
I'm shocked, Glenda. I'm shocked to hear that the embassy and consulate are ringing you. You've clearly been subverted. This will be more evidence for the next
I think they then sent a note. They then sent a note.
The Australian media is being undermined because they're ringing Glenda Korporaal.
Question in front. Yep. Sorry. Sure. One more. We can have this question, then we can wrap it up. Yep. Can we have this question, please? Yep. Yep.
Thank you very much. I'm Kevin Knobgood-Brown. Thank you to all three panelists. Very interesting and thought-provoking comments. My question is about coronavirus. It burst onto the scene, as James' chart indicated 3 weeks ago. People didn't even think about it. Now, virtually everybody in China is in lockdown. All the people that we work with are staying at home. I understand that the National People's Congress has been postponed from March to April, which speaks volumes about how this is being perceived by the government. I'd like to hear your views about what you think the coronavirus situation will do to China in 2020, politically, socially. We've got the economic analysis, I think, but I'm very interested to hear what you think it may impact on China politically and socially this year.
Okay, I'll throw that to the panel, and let's keep our responses short and sharp.
There is a temptation to think this might undermine the Xi Jinping government, but I don't think it will. One thing I really hope is that it will lead to an attention in China's healthcare and hospital system, which is has needed a lot more investment. But I don't think we can. I think it's probably knocked Xi Jinping's confidence. Last year you had the big military parade, so it possibly will. There'll be a little bit more subdued China on the world stage. But I really hope that some of the billions that are going into the Pacific Islands, into Africa, might go into the Chinese health system as well. Hopefully, this prompts them to look back at their own domestic situation and look after ordinary people who are now crowded more and more into cities in China.
Any other comments?
Well said, Glenda. Very good points. I think if you look back at SARS, it did force greater transparency and openness on China. Not entirely, because we now know that at least for a couple of weeks the coronavirus has been concealed. And I think the most incredibly important visual image for me in the last couple of weeks was the fact that the Chinese government built a 1,000-bed hospital in 10 days. It speaks volumes. And I hope that people in China take the message that China is unbelievably capable at hardware. It's incredibly good at hardware, but its software is hopeless. And it continues to be so. And that's all tied to lack of transparency and openness of society. And I think Chinese people in China will actually get that. And I think it's been a soft power disaster for China because they don't get the software side of things right.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending this UTS Big Thinking Forum, looking at a big topic of the Australia-China relationship and the first public event of the Australia-China Relations Institute in 2020. Will you join me, please, in thanking our panellists tonight, Glenda Korporaal, Geoff Raby and Osmond Chiu for their contributions tonight.